Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Phyllis Summers had always been a woman who operated in the gray areas of morality, a master manipulator capable of crossing boundaries when she believed the ends justified the means. But even for her, the unfolding scandal surrounding Noah Newman represented a descent into a darkness she had not fully anticipated. And as the terrifying truth finally came to light, longtime viewers of The Young and the Restless found themselves confronted with one of the most shocking twists in recent memory. Not only had Noah been kidnapped, but the entire plot had been executed by none other than Phyllis and Cain Ashby, a scandalous partnership of desperation, self-preservation and misguided revenge. And to make matters even more astonishing, the two had conspired to frame Matt Clark, dragging up his criminal past and turning him into the perfect scapegoat while they hid Noah away from the world. For weeks, Genoa City had been drowning in dread and confusion as Noah vanished without a trace, leaving behind only tension, fear, and accusations that ripped through the Newman family like wildfire. And at the center of the storm was Nick Newman, who found himself reliving the traumatic memories of every crisis he had ever endured as a father, brother, and son, struggling to make sense of impossible evidence that seemed to point toward Matt, the man notorious for his history with Sharon and the Newman family, a man whose reputation made him an easy target for suspicion. And yet beneath the panic and the assumptions lay a carefully constructed lie that had been engineered by two people no one expected to work together. Cain Ashby, once seen as a stable figure who had fought tirelessly to protect his family and rebuild his fractured life, had joined forces with Phyllis in secrecy, and together they wove a plan that began not as pure malice, but as a complicated act of retaliation. Cain, convinced that the Newmans had destroyed too many lives, and Phyllis, blinded by her belief that protecting her daughter and securing power justified drastic action, found themselves standing side by side in a conspiracy that quickly spiraled beyond anything they could control. Their decision to kidnap Noah had not been born overnight. It was a calculated move meant to shake the Newmans to their core, a message delivered through the most painful weapon possible, the disappearance of a loved one. And in the early days, Phyllis had convinced herself that Noah would be safe, that the ordeal would end quickly, and that the fallout would be targeted, surgical, and survivable. But reality rarely favors those who gamble with other people's lives. As Noah woke up in captivity, confusion giving way to fear and then outrage, he demanded explanations from Cain and Phyllis, but the two conspirators knew that giving answers would only worsen the situation, and instead they fed him half-formed reassurances that everything would end soon, that he would not be harmed, and that he simply needed to cooperate until the plan was complete. Yet even in their attempts to appear in control, cracks were already forming, and with each passing day the weight of what they had done bore down on them more heavily. Meanwhile, back in Genoa City, Matt found himself the center of an intensifying manhunt and public condemnation, the witnesses, digital trails, planted evidence, and twisting accusations all pointing toward him with ruthless precision. And though he tried to proclaim his innocence, few were willing to believe him, given his history of villainy, manipulation, and crimes that had scarred the Newman family years earlier. Sharon struggled to remain composed as memories of Matt's past tormented her mind, and Nick, torn between logic and protective fury, found himself pacing the halls of the Newman ranch, driven by desperation, vowing to bring Matt down once and for all if Noah was not returned unharmed. Victor Newman, who had spent decades shielding his children through every imaginable crisis, mobilized his influence and connections across the city and beyond, launching a search that reached into every dark corner of the criminal networks he knew were capable of kidnapping his grandson. But even the great Victor Newman could not anticipate that the threat was coming not from a hardened criminal in the shadows, but from within the circle of people the family interacted with every day. As days turned into weeks, Phyllis found herself grappling with the haunting consequences of her choices. Isolated moments when she looked at Noah, angry, frightened, and growing more determined to escape, and was confronted with the horrifying realization that she had become the villain in her own story, the very type of person she had spent years fighting against. And yet her pride and fear kept her from turning back, for to confess now would mean losing everything. Her freedom, her credibility, and perhaps even her family. Cain, too, found himself slipping into a darker version of himself, haunted by the escalating chaos, the fractures in his motivations widening as the enormity of what they had done began to overwhelm him. And while he had believed striking at the Newmans was justified, Watching Noah suffer made it clear that their revenge had gone too far. But before either conspirator could act to correct their course, the situation worsened. The evidence against Matt reached a breaking point, and the police prepared to issue a formal arrest warrant, while Nick, pushed to emotional extremes, confronted Matt in a violent showdown, demanding answers and threatening consequences if Noah was not returned. Matt, cornered and desperate, refused to take responsibility for a crime he did not commit, and in his frustration he revealed to Nick that he believed someone else must be behind the kidnapping, someone who knew enough about his past to recreate the patterns of his previous misdeeds. And though Nick rejected the idea initially, a seed of doubt found its way into his mind. Meanwhile, Noah, never content to remain a victim, began plotting his escape, observing his surroundings, charting Cain and Phyllis's movements, and slowly piecing together the truth behind his abduction. He learned that he was being hidden in a remote, abandoned property outside Genoa City, and though the building was locked and guarded, he believed he could make a run for it if he timed everything perfectly. Phyllis, increasingly panicked by the pressure around her, argued with Cain daily, insisting that they needed to release Noah before the situation grew irreversible. But Cain, terrified of exposure and the consequences that would destroy his life, refused to budge, believing that if they could just hold out a bit longer, the Newmans would fall apart under the strain. But his hope was flawed, and the walls were closing in fast. Then, in a dramatic twist, Noah finally succeeded in his escape attempt, ambushing Cain during a moment of inattention and bolting out into the night, running through the woods toward the distant road while Cain stumbled after him, shouting for him to stop. Noah managed to evade him long enough to reach a nearby highway and flag down a passing driver, who immediately recognized the missing Newman heir and rushed him to safety. And the moment the news broke, Genoa City exploded with relief, outrage, and renewed suspicion as Noah tearfully confirmed that not only had he been kidnapped, but Matt had been framed, and the true culprits were none other than Cain and Phyllis. The revelation sent shockwaves through every family, business, and social circle in town. Nick, upon hearing his son's account, felt a mix of guilt and fury, realizing he had nearly destroyed an innocent man while the true villains had been people he once trusted. And Sharon was left shaking as she processed the fact that those closest to them had inflicted this unimaginable trauma not just on Noah, but on the entire Newman family. Victor, hearing the confession straight from Noah's lips, transformed from concerned patriarch into a force of unrestrained vengeance, vowing that Cain and Phyllis would pay for what they had done, both legally and personally. Meanwhile, Matt, upon finally being cleared of suspicion, felt vindicated but not entirely satisfied, as the damage to his reputation had deepened once again, and though he despised the Newmans, he had never expected to be dragged into a conspiracy of this magnitude. With Noah safely returned, the focus shifted to capturing Cain and Phyllis, who were now fugitives in every sense of the word, and as the police closed in, Phyllis found herself breaking emotionally, realizing that she could no longer outrun the consequences of her actions, and when she was finally arrested, she collapsed in defeat, confessing her role in the kidnapping through tears, unable to justify what she had done beyond acknowledging that she had allowed power, bitterness, and fear to consume her. Cain, on the other hand, attempted to escape town, but he was cornered by the authorities and forced to surrender. His final moments before arrest spent trying to explain that he had acted out of desperation, though no one was willing to listen. Noah, though physically safe, remained burdened by the trauma of what he had endured, and the Newman family rallied around him as they prepared for a long process of healing and rebuilding. But even in their relief lay a painful truth, that betrayal comes not from distant enemies, but often from those closest to us. The fallout rippled across Genoa City for weeks, with friendships destroyed, alliances shattered, and every family forced to confront the terrifying reality of how far people could fall when pushed to their limits. And as court dates, sentencing battles, and emotional confrontations played out, fans of the young and the restless were reminded once again that in this world, the truth always comes out, but never without leaving scars that may never fully heal. The aftermath of the truth coming out about Phyllis and Cain kidnapping Noah and framing Matt Clark tore Genoa City apart in ways the residents never imagined, and even though Noah was alive and physically recovering at home surrounded by loved ones, the emotional wounds pulsed through the Newman family like open circuits, refusing to close, because Noah's abduction wasn't just a shocking crime, it was a personal violation that reordered how everyone saw trust, loyalty, and loyalty's haunting absence. Nick Newman, who had grown up surviving countless scandals, business wars, betrayals, and heartbreaks, found himself feeling something he could hardly admit out loud. Guilt, because in his desperation to save his son, he had been seconds away from destroying Matt Clark without proof, letting rage eclipse reason, proving that sometimes even good people lose their way under pressure. He paced his living room late into the night, replaying every moment of the ordeal in his mind, every threat he had spoken to Matt, every hour he wasted searching in the wrong place, every clue that now seemed obvious in hindsight, and he could not help but ask himself the question that tormented him. How had he not seen the signs sooner? How had he not realized that Phyllis was acting strangely? How had he not noticed that Kane's growing resentment had turned inward and poisonous? Sharon, meanwhile, wrestled with her own emotional implosion, because Noah's disappearance triggered trauma from her past. Every threat, every forced separation, every wound that had been inflicted on her children already. And though she tried to be strong for Noah, she found herself waking up at night, rushing to Noah's door just to make sure he was still there, still breathing, still safe. And in those quiet moments she would sit at the edge of her bed, holding her hands against her head as the memories returned in painful succession. Victor Newman, patriarch until his final breath, channeled his grief and fury into action the only way he knew how, by ensuring that Phyllis and Kane would face maximum punishment, and not just legal punishment but financial, social, and psychological consequences as well, because to Victor, this crime represented not merely an attack on Noah but an attempt to cripple the Newman dynasty itself, and that, in his world, was unforgivable. He called in attorneys, private investigators, business partners, and strategic allies, activating the quiet network of influence that only Victor Newman truly controlled, and he began quietly preparing to dismantle Kane's remaining financial supports and professional connections, ensuring that even beyond prison, Kane's world would crumble brick by brick. And as for Phyllis, Victor found himself in the strangest emotional position, because for years, despite everything, he had tolerated her, supported her, even admired her fire when it was directed at the family's enemies rather than toward themselves. But now something had broken permanently, and his gaze hardened when he spoke her name. Nikki Newman was perhaps the only one who fully understood the emotional fracture spreading through Victor, and though she too was furious, she reminded him that revenge, if taken too far, could rot the soul, and she feared what Victor might become if he chased retribution without limits. But Victor responded only with cold assurance that he would not stop until Noah's attackers paid a price equal to the trauma they had inflicted. Meanwhile, Noah tried to resume a sense of normalcy. He sat in front of his bedroom mirror some mornings and stared at his reflection, searching for the version of himself he had been before the kidnapping, but he could not find that version anymore because captivity had changed him, not just in fear but in clarity. He remembered the hours spent in the dark room, the sound of Kane and Phyllis arguing in the hallway, their voices wavering between blame, desperation, and fear, and he remembered the realization that his life was not guaranteed, that he might never see his parents, siblings, or the Genoa city skyline again, and in that cell, Noah found a resolve that now made him different. He told himself that he would not be a silent victim. He would testify, he would stand in court, he would confront Kane and Phyllis face to face, not for revenge but for accountability. What Noah did not realize was that his bravery inspired others, but it also triggered a deeper fracture within Kane and Phyllis, who were sitting in separate jail cells awaiting arraignment, facing felony charges that could result in decades in prison. Phyllis, once the queen of fast talk, strategizing, and manipulation, found that for the first time in a long time, she couldn't spin her way out of the situation. The evidence was overwhelming, the motive was indefensible, and worst of all, she had hurt a young man who had once trusted her presence in his life. She sat at the metal table during her private interview session with her attorney, hands clasped together, fingers trembling, attempting to articulate why she had done what she had done, but her explanation sounded hollow, even to her. She spoke about protecting her daughter, about feeling cornered by the Newmans, about believing that one decisive strike would shake the power structure in town long enough to give her leverage. But as she spoke, tears surfaced, because listening to her own words made her realize that she had allowed paranoia and ambition to corrode her moral compass. Her attorney, a seasoned criminal defense specialist, told her bluntly that unless she accepted a plea deal, she could be facing decades behind bars, and as the words settled in her chest like lead weights, she found herself quietly whispering, "What have I done?" In the neighboring cell block, Kane was not dealing with remorse the same way. He was angry, not just at himself but at fate, at the Newmans, at the years of feeling overshadowed and undervalued. And though he knew that what he had done was unforgivable, he could not detach himself from the belief that life had cornered him into a decision he couldn't reverse. In the months following the sentencing of Phyllis and Cain, life in Genoa City settled into a strange rhythm where normalcy attempted to return, yet emotional fault lines remained everywhere, because even though justice had been served in the courtroom, the psychic shock of betrayal from two people who once existed within the fabric of daily life continued to reverberate through homes, offices, boardrooms, and whispered conversations across town, and each family coped in different ways, just as each individual struggled to make sense of how close they had all come to losing Noah forever. Noah himself, though outwardly improving, still felt the invisible fractures inside him, cracks that showed not in dramatic ways but in quiet moments, when a door slammed too loudly and he tensed, when he woke in the middle of the night struggling to breathe, when he hesitated before trusting someone entirely, and though therapy was helping, Noah realized healing wasn't a destination but an ongoing process, and he learned to honor that without letting it consume him. He spent more time with Sharon and Nick, finding a renewed appreciation for family dinners, morning coffee talks, and shared silence that required no commentary, because knowing that his parents were physically near provided a safety he didn't realize he still needed. Sharon, watching her son heal, felt maternal instincts sharpen again, and she made it her mission to be present without hovering, encouraging Noah to talk about whatever came up, even when the conversations dipped into dark memories. She reminded him that speaking the truth was not reliving the trauma but releasing it, something she had learned painfully over the course of decades spent fighting ghosts of her own past. Nick, too, worked on his own emotional recovery, making peace with the fact that he had nearly destroyed an innocent man in his rage and panic. He apologized to Matt Clark directly, an apology that did not erase their tumultuous history but demonstrated that Nick was willing to grow rather than dig deeper into bitterness. That moment shocked Matt, who stood still as Nick spoke plainly and sincerely, acknowledging that fear had driven him to a dangerous edge, and that if Noah hadn't escaped when he did, Nick might have crossed a line he could never return from. Matt, surprised by the admission, struggled to respond at first, because receiving an apology from a Newman was nearly as shocking as being cleared of a kidnapping he didn't commit, and after a long silence, he nodded and told Nick that though they would never be friends, he accepted the apology because both men were tired of letting the past dictate every interaction. Meanwhile, Victor, though satisfied that justice had played out in court, felt the weight of the emotional toll as he walked through the empty halls of Newman Ranch at night, glancing up at the portraits of his family lining the walls, portraits of Nikki, Victoria, Adam, Nick, Abby, grandchildren and generations of Newmans who had survived countless attacks, financial wars, betrayals and heartbreak yet continued to stand, and he realized that they had always survived not because they were flawless but because they refused to fracture from within. Victor was not a man who cried easily, but on one late evening, standing alone with a glass of bourbon in his hand, he felt his throat tighten as he remembered holding Noah as a child, teaching him to fish, celebrating school milestones, and watching him grow into a young man, and the thought that someone they trusted had nearly stolen Noah's life ignited a grief unlike any business loss or physical threat he had ever endured. Nikki found him that night and didn't lecture or soothe. She simply placed a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing, knowing that presence was the language Victor responded to best. Over at Chancellor Winters, Cain's downfall triggered internal and external repercussions. The company faced board scrutiny, shareholder concerns, and media pressure that Jill was forced to handle with the fury and composure of a woman who had spent her entire life cleaning up messes left by others. She held an emergency board meeting, reminding everyone that while Cain's actions reflected his personal dissent, his betrayal would not be allowed to stain the legacy or stability of Chancellor Winters, and she ordered a swift strengthening of internal controls to prevent any executive from spiraling under the radar again. Devin and Lily found themselves in a complicated emotional position, both furious at Cain for the damage he had caused, yet unwilling to pretend that he had once been nothing but a monster, because the man they knew once tried desperately to be better. Lily, sitting alone in her apartment one evening, pulled up old photographs of better days. Family holidays, her children's birthdays, quiet dinners where Cain smiled like a man grateful to be alive, and she allowed herself to feel the grief of loving someone who lost himself. She wasn't in love with Cain anymore, but she never stopped caring about the father of her children, and watching the town demonize him without acknowledging the complicated tapestry of his life felt like another loss layered on top of a years-long grieving process. Across town at Crimson Lights, Sharon hosted informal community counseling nights, open to anyone recovering from the emotional shockwaves of the kidnapping case, and people came. Not just the Newmans, but residents who had been triggered by memories of their own traumas. Because Genoa City was a town where almost everyone had been through something dramatic at one point or another. These evenings became a quiet ritual, a gathering where pain could be spoken without judgment, and even Noah found himself attending some nights. Not to tell his own story repeatedly, but to listen to others, because hearing how other people carried their wounds helped him understand that being broken didn't make someone weak. Phyllis, meanwhile, began serving her sentence, and imprisonment hit her like a series of emotional avalanches. First denial, then anger, then despair, then resignation. At first, she refused visitors, convinced that she didn't deserve redemption, and that no one would ever want to see her again. But after weeks of isolation, she finally agreed to see Summer. The reunion was strained, painful, and gut-wrenchingly human. Summer walked into the visitation room with shoulders tense and eyes red. Torn between fury at the unimaginable trauma her mother had inflicted and heartache at seeing the woman who raised her behind glass and steel. Phyllis broke down almost immediately, apologizing through tears, not just for the kidnapping but for every moment she had allowed insecurity, ambition,